The U.S. government has paused negotiations on the expansive Columbia River Treaty, saying the current administration is reviewing its international engagements. Now, the treaty is decades old.
We have millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snow caps in Canada and all pouring down. And they have essentially a very large faucet.
That statement reframed water as leverage, not climate, not drought management, leverage. When a US presidential candidate talks about redirecting Canadian water south, it signals something larger than campaign rhetoric. It introduces the idea that cross-border rivers can be treated as negotiable assets. The Columbia River alone supports billions in hydropower generation and flood control. It is governed by a treaty first signed in 1964. That framework regulates storage, power sharing, and downstream protections. Once water is discussed alongside tariffs, the strategic environment shifts. It becomes part of trade language. That changes the pressure points. Canada is not just defending rainfall or snowpack. It is defending jurisdiction. It is defending how natural resources are classified inside trade frameworks like NAFTA and its successor agreements. Subscribe for more updates.
Water is not part of NAFTA officially, but that has been contested. And so this whole rhetoric and talk around tariffs right now begs the question, along with Donald Trump openly contesting the boundary treaty, which is in fact defined, the boundary between Canada and the US is actually defined in the Waters Treaty. That was the first time that it was actually surveyed. So it does beg the question as to whether there is some interest by the U.S. in bringing water, Canadian water specifically, and transboundary water into tariff talk and into NAFTA again.
That is the escalation point. Tariffs are not just economic tools, they are negotiation triggers. When boundary treaties are mentioned in the same breath as tariffs, the issue moves beyond water management. It becomes sovereignty management. The Columbia River Treaty was renegotiated in principle in 2024, but not ratified before a new U.S. administration. That pause created uncertainty. When uncertainty exists, leverage expands. If transboundary water enters tariff discussions, Canada faces a new category of exposure. Energy markets are linked. Hydropower generated downstream in Washington and Oregon depends on upstream storage in British Columbia. That storage functions like infrastructure. It is predictable. It is structured. Introducing trade pressure into that structure changes calculations in Ottawa. It raises the question, is water a resource, or is it a bargaining chip? That is where strategic risk begins.
Many of the rivers that cross the Canada-US boundary are used for hydropower production. So that's an energy-based resource. And we know this administration is extremely focused on creating better and cheaper access to energy in the United States. And part of that comes from water that is generated, in the case of the Columbia River Treaty, from water that is stored on the Canadian side and promised to the US, almost like a battery in a way in a cell phone. Canada stores the water, and then the US can use that to generate hydropower on the American side.
That comparison matters. A battery implies stored capacity, controlled release, predictable output. Canada's upstream reservoirs regulate flow that supports American hydropower generation worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. That energy stability feeds into broader North American grids. It is infrastructure by another name. When economic motivation drives tariff strategy, resource control becomes negotiation currency. Water, in that sense, supports electricity pricing, flood mitigation costs, and agricultural stability downstream. If one side views storage as an economic asset tied to trade talks, the conversation shifts from environmental cooperation to market advantage. That is the exposure Canada is addressing. Because once natural resource management intersects with tariff policy, legal frameworks built decades ago face modern economic pressure. And that pressure is rarely symbolic.
Real difference between what is being said by the political leaders in a more heated context and what is actually happening on the ground. That said, this is not a new debate in some ways. You know, there's a long history of the U.S. having interest in Canada's water resources that dates back long before we have the current laws in place. And in fact, there was agreements back in the 1940s with discussions in the U.S. Congress in order to divert water, massive amounts of water from Canada to the U.S. We had this through the 80s and 90s with the Great Lakes, and now once again, here we are.
History shapes leverage. Discussions about diverting Canadian water are not new. Proposals surfaced in the 1940s. They reappeared during Great Lakes debates in the 1980s and 1990s. Each time, sovereignty concerns surfaced quickly. Water is not formally classified as a tradable commodity under NAFTA frameworks, but once contested language enters public debate, classification itself becomes negotiable terrain. That is the core strategic concern. If water is ever reframed as a tradable resource rather than a sovereign asset, federal and provincial authority structures come under strain. In Canada, water governance largely sits with provinces. That creates complexity in coordinated defense. The pressure point is legal definition. Change that, and negotiation dynamics shift dramatically.
Tricia Stadnik is a professor at the University of Calgary with expertise in continental water resource supply. She is also a Canadian research chair in hydraulic modeling. She says he is referring to the Columbia River, which starts in British Columbia and runs through Washington State and Oregon before ending up in the Pacific Ocean. She says there's no direct water connection from Canada to California.
We can't just be taking water and diverting it and sending it somewhere else. Besides that, every time that we're asked to do that, it's a sign that we're living outside of our means.
The technical barrier is real. Rivers are not faucets. Diversions require dams, engineering corridors, environmental approvals, and cross-jurisdictional agreements. They alter ecosystems. They shift agricultural patterns. They create long-term legal consequences. But politically, the debate is not about plumbing. It is about positioning. When water enters tariff rhetoric, even hypothetically, Canada responds defensively. That response is not emotional, it is structural. A federal strategy becomes necessary. Coordination between provinces and Ottawa becomes urgent. Because once natural resources are mentioned in trade disputes, the boundary between environmental policy and economic leverage narrows. That is why this debate matters. It is not about gallons. It is about control. Subscribe for more updates.